Hi, folks, with Tassus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the disappearing, vanishing middle class in the West, and also look at what hitherto were the defining characteristics, the markers, if you like, of what constituted middle class has changed. And it was changing anyway, sort of if you go back 100 years, there are different and numerous changes to how the middle class was recognised and identified. But just looking at how, if today we assume that expendable income after having paid the essentials of life are one of the key indicators of middle class, then how that's caused a shrinking of the middle class over the last 50 years. And we can also pose the question, is middle class entering a new definition? Will it even exist? Is there the hoi polloi and the elites? Is that where we're heading, as it was in the pretty much, at least in the medieval times? So let's just have a look at that as a wider issue. Now, the identifying markers and defining markers, if you like, of middle class, what constitutes a middle class person or a family or worker, has changed a lot recently. The markers used to be sort of status related. Now, if you had an above average income, it typically meant that you had an above average education and thus an above average intelligence, that sort of thing. So there was not that it was perfect and absolutely universal in every single situation. There were builders that had left school at 14 and went on to do very well, and owned construction companies. So there were aberrations, but very few. Typically, it followed that pattern outside of people who were born into wealth and part of the aristocracy. If you went to an expensive private school, the assumption was that you had which was true, you had certainly an above average education, an intensive education, which cultivated all sorts of intellectual capacities and so on. So they're identifying status marks, so status related to income, related to position, and so on. So if you had a university degree, it wasn't assumed, it was known that you were a bright person, and that you would go on to make an income substantially above someone that didn't have a university education, and so on. So these were defining characteristics, if you like, of the middle class. So there was some behavioural related thing. Middle class, the working classes were considered to be rather vulgar and uncouth, and the middle classes were socially aspirational, more polite and more measured and more caring, and so on. Just to get, just a quick sort of illustration here. Some years ago, quite close together, I saw obviously a very lost and very unhappy dog sort of roaming around. It was thirsty and quite clearly stressed. It lost its owner or been dumped or something or other. Walking through a middle class area, no one gave a shit, really. Hardly. And that same, a very similar situation where a dog's walking through a middle class area, people are running around, trying to help the dog and trying to get hold of it so they can look after it, and this sort of thing. It was a very different reaction, and that again, I think, is people in the middle class have got more time to contemplate the universe than working class people that are living more on a hand-to-mouth basis and haven't got the time or the inclination to care about other issues other than their immediate needs. So anyway, coming back to the defining middle class, all the markers that were once middle class have been thrown into disarray because of affirmative action and quotas. Now anyone can have a degree, even if they've got an IQ of 80 or less. Degrees are allocated now by central planning, ideological central planning committees. So, and I've interviewed sort of affirmative action, say engineering degree holders, and the difference between them and the straight white male who had to earn the degree is really, it's worlds apart. The affirmative action hires come across as affirmative action hires. I mean, they might as well have never bothered to go to university at all. They're still snot-nosed high school, punk bimbos that would have had to drop out of junior high school in a real world, or affirmative action race hires and that sort of thing. So the university degree is no longer a master's or a PhD. They've been just allocated out to every minority. They can lay their hands on as a sign of status and confidence building and so on, whether it's been earned or not. So the idea of earning something on any form of merit has pretty much disappeared from Western society. Merit through loyalty to globalist causes, you can still do well from that, but actual merit on achievement, capability, performance, these sorts of things, that's gone pretty much, at least it's gone from Western society now, and this affirmative action and so on has played a big role in that. So those markers are what may have identified a middle class sort of person are gone. Now there are other things. Given the non-market related forces, there are so many business commercial transactions, movements of money, decisions about investment that are not based on market forces and are not based on organic natural occurrences. But this has created vast distortions in where wealth has moved. So say there's I've used this example before. As a woman got divorced, she divorced from a particularly industrious, conscientious, high-income husband, scored a nice house, free house in the process. Then the son, who is a no good wastrel, works occasionally as a labourer on a building site, just doesn't give a shit. And his mother gets cancer and dies, and he's inherited a $2 million house, and so he's suddenly become a multi-millionaire, and yet he's earned nothing, contributed nothing, made nothing, has no capability in any meritorious context, but suddenly has inherited, again, as a multi-millionaire through inheritance. Now he'll go on to blow that, because he'll take loans out to buy fancy cars and do this and do that and so on. But the reality is he's going to blow out. In fact, has blown nearly all of it. So having multi-millions isn't a marker either of one's status, as in middle class or class status. So the lines there have been completely blurred. Now there's obviously the elites. They're very much pushing your hoi polloi, you don't matter anymore type stuff. But the elites are very, very small in number. 1 in 500, less. So there's a very small number of people that fit that elite category in terms of wealth. People like Bill Gates and so on who are very wealthy. Really, I think to sort of make it into the elites, today's money at least, you need 25 to 30 million US dollars to even get an entry ticket to sit in the back row. So all those things of middle class, the jobs you have, if you were the the general manager or the vice president or something of company X, then you were considered to be someone of status and thus middle, if not upper middle class. But that's changed now again with affirmative action. I'm pretty much every day now I come across people that through affirmative action have been over promoted to levels that would have been undreamt of even 30 years ago. So that again has blurred. So what does middle class? How do you define middle class today? It's given the change in the costs of living. Middle class today is probably going to be how much expendable income you have left after you've paid all the essentials of life. Now I'll go back into the Victorian era. This is the world, particularly Britain, being the leader in this area of industrialising. And there's steam trains, there's factories, there's spinning jennies, there's all sorts of things, steamships and the like. So this is where the modern idea of a middle class worker sort of really came from. Now the middle class previously would have been considered skilled artisans. Now there weren't that many of them, but they would have been the middle class and the traders, the artisan traders of the even in the medieval times. We look at the Italian city-states, for example. But artisans had particular skills that weren't easy. They took a long time to acquire. They were employers. They maybe had a couple of apprentices, that sort of thing. Now, pre-industrial age, that was kind of the size of really a business. You would call that a commercial enterprise back in the medieval times. So farming, of course, was really the major or primary undertaking agriculture of most people, and they were serfs living on land that were owned by the aristocracy. So in the modern era, the people with particular skills started to appear. And you can see, say, in the British naval establishment, people that were skilled at map making, cartography, and things like that. People that were particularly skilled at carpentry, and you could say they were kind of a middle class, I guess. But in the Victorian era, the middle class was working class people who had continuous employment. So a working class person was assumed to be a labourer with maybe not so much in the way of skills, or very limited skills, if any, and maybe not a particularly conscientious attitude. So workers were sort of just got occasional jobs, then intermittent jobs. They would go from place to place doing general labouring type work, and they were considered the working class. Now, if you had a certain set of skills, you could operate particular machinery, you were skilled at that, or you had other skills, because this is pre being a tradesman. To some extent, carpentry, for example, was considered a trade then, but things we see today, electricians, plumbers, all that sort of stuff, that didn't really exist at the time, and didn't really exist until really the 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, when it started to come in as a standardized form of education and registration in terms of electricians and the like, gas fitters and so on. So a working class person was, again, in social status terms, a working class person with skills who had continuous employment. That was middle class, because it meant you could sort of plan ahead and take loans and do all sorts of things that a working class person really couldn't do or even contemplate. So that's the genesis, really, of the modern middle class. And I went through a few twists and turns, such as when university education started to appear, and as a widespread, or 2 or 3% of the population, really. Which when I left high school, that was about the state of it. Maybe 5% of kids who'd started high school went on to university. It was very merit based. You didn't have the grades. You just couldn't do it. More than a third of those kids dropped out of university. They couldn't hack the pace. The hard work and the strictly pass or fail, merit only. They were beginning to introduce courses such as peace studies and those sort of sociology things. They were just coming in, but it was only girls that did that sort of stuff, certainly at the time. So anyway, the concept of what constituted a middle class person changed. Now, I remember, being a young guy, I was in awe of people who had PhD. Even masters was pretty hot shit, but I was in awe of people who had a PhD, doctor, and it could be doctor of metallurgy or doctor of chemistry or something, a PhD. And I go, wow! And these people commanded such respect. They walked into the room. There was a certain hush would sort of appear because somebody with a PhD had walked in the room. Now they hand it out to any minority, like the quota of certain universities have quotas for black lesbians where they give them PhD. So those things clearly aren't markers of middle class. What constitutes middle class? Now, just looking at 1970s, 2/3, in fact, even approaching 3/4 of the working population, which pretty much anyone who had a full-time job, was considered middle class. Now, the cost of living was such that the purchasing power of the paycheck of the guy working in the factory allowed him to have a sort of a dependent wife and 2.4 children. a pretty basic type of three-bedroom house, nothing fancy. He's got an pretty ordinary car, but he can afford to buy a new one, on payment terms. You can have a driving holiday once a year, maybe twice, that sort of thing. Now, those sort of people were everywhere in the West, during that time, but they're certainly not anymore. Now, I just want to sort of illustrate the point of where have the middle class gone. And it's down to expendable income, in my view. So I'd say that's the new paradigm for identifying the middle class, and indeed also serves as a useful measure of looking where the middle class has gone. So if you look at, say, in 1976, the average rent or mortgage payment, which tended to track each other reasonably closely, I'll use rent as the indicator here, but assuming the average income here, the average rent, this is again assuming like a three-bedroom house sort of thing, was 37% of your take-home income, like after tax, after Social Security. So 37% of your net income, as it's called, would be spent on rent. Now, again, this is most families had a dependent wife and children at the time. Maybe, when the children started going to high school, she would work part-time, something like, that sort of stuff would go on. But the people on the lowest incomes would often have two-income families. So, the guy working in the warehouse was just a labourer, if you like, in the warehouse. His wife would also work as, on the checkout at the local store, that type of thing. And they would often have, like, grandparents would look after the children while the parents were at work, that sort of stuff. Really, only people that could get that sort of help could do it. But even those with two of the lowest incomes, they could work. They could buy a house and have vacations and so on. I think I remember there's two people. They both, he again worked in the storeroom at a supermarket. She worked in the checkout, and they lived quite a decent lifestyle. Having buying a house and the car and having children and all the bits and pieces. So 37% of the average three-bedroom house rent, and I stress this is the average because in some of the ritzier inner suburbs the rents were higher, and some of the more in the newer outer suburbs, when there's no there's no paved sidewalks, things like that, and there's only septic tanks and so on, the rents of course would be cheaper there on a relative basis. So but now today, just to give you, so 37% in 1976, that's the average amount of rent, 37% of the average take-home pay. Now today, just to illustrate the huge difference, and I appreciate this is getting on 50 years, but today, just shy of 90%, 88% of take-home pay has to be spent on the average rent of an average three-bedroom house today. And this, I'm using Sydney as an example here, but that just goes to show you the difference. So it's more, decently more than double the amount of, in fact, getting on for 2.5 times. In fact, if you look at the relative difference of the amount of houses are now in outer suburbs, that's kind of skewed it, because what were middle distance suburbs back in the day are now outer distance suburbs, which have sort of slightly skewed those numbers. If we just sort of include the middle distance suburbs to get an exact apples for apples match with 1976, then it's about 110% of the average wage is now for paying rent in those suburbs. So again, inner to middle distance suburbs. But just again, using the reality of the day versus that reality, it's 88% or 89% of take-home pay goes on. Now, even if you add in a second income on the average wage, so a two-income household on the average pay, it's still just on 45% of household take-home pay is consumed with the average rent. So 2 average pays to the average rent. So that just shows you the difference in the cost of living now, just in accommodation, just that, nothing else. That's before you look at the 25 to 30% increase in food, the 30 to 40% increase in energy compared to back then. And you start adding these in, and you can see now that two people on the average, even two incomes in the household of the average income, they can't afford to have children. Without generous government handouts or without grandparents helping them out, without inheritance, without all that sort of stuff, they can't even dream of having children at that sort of level. So this is the difference, and this is where the middle class has gone. That there's fewer and fewer people that can actually afford to buy a house or pay the rent and have substantial. So I think in order to be middle class, you need something approaching 2/3 of your income as disposable income once you've paid for the essentials. Now that 2/3 of income may be discretion. You may put it into buying a much better house, or having more vacations, or having children, or buying more gadgets, or going into consumer goods or something. You may put it anywhere. That's the secondary thing. But if your choice is limited very much today compared to what it was then. So I think middle class is, you need approximately 2/3 of income as disposable after having paid the essentials. Whereas as today, after the essentials are paid, maybe less than 40% of your income is disposable, and I think it needs to be 65%. So I think even a two-income household has about half the income after they've met the essentials, half the income disposable income that they need in order to qualify as middle class. Now, maybe middle class in the future will mean something else, but at the moment, it's given it's non-merit based, then disposable income would seem to be about the only measure of somebody who could be middle class. Now, if you look at the amount of people that can afford to live in, the middle class suburb today is now, in defining that as freestanding house, the tree-lined street. There are good schools nearby. There are no gangs sort of roaming the streets. These sort of things. Even the drug dealers wear designer clothes and drive BMWs. That type of thing. Then only a very small percentage of the population. I mean, just to give you an idea, that cost of houses in those sort of in a middle class area in Sydney, as a case in point, the entry level is $2.75 million. That's the entry level, and that's, and if you bought a place for $2.75 million, you'd have to look at spending at least $500,000 to renovate and remodel it. So that's the entry level for getting into the middle class. Now, if you look at the cost of servicing a mortgage like that, there's not even 1% of the population can afford, from their income, not even 1% of the population can afford to live in a middle class area. So that'll give you an idea as to where the middle class has gone, how it's shrunk and why it's shrunk, and where the new definitions of what a middle class person is. But until we get merit and value and intrinsic value and real value, back into the process of society and social structures, then we're going to have this thing of where really everyone is, pretty much everyone, sort of the 99%, are really going to be the feudal serfs of the medieval times. And I think we're close to that already. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.